suggests that we are living through the mother of all recessions, possibly the deepest for 300 years. And with millions of us relying on state support, borrowing this year is set to dwarf even what we saw during the financial crisis. What does this all mean for our future economy and our future prospects? Let me ask the man in charge of marking the government's economic figures. Robert Chote is chairman of the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility, and he joins me now. Welcome, Mr. Chote. Can I ask you, first of all, very simple question. People see these predictions, worst for 300 years, etc., etc., etc. How worried should people be themselves?
Well, the key worry is if you have not just a very sharp downturn in the economy, but one that scars its future potential. So people shouldn't panic in the sense that we know that the economy, probably at its worst last month, may have been a third or so smaller than it normally would have been in terms of the output of goods and services and people's spending. But that should be the worst of it, and we now go into a period of recovery as the restrictions are loosened. So the key issues in terms of how bad this feels and the impact for the public finances are how swift that recovery is and whether the economy is permanently scarred at the end of it, i.e. we come out of this with the economy being smaller than we would have anticipated going in. That's a bigger question than exactly how deep it is at the worst point.
Yes. There's a whole alphabet of possible shapes of recovery, a U-shaped recovery, an L-shaped recovery, which is no recovery at all. But you have said at the OBR you're hoping for a V-shaped recovery, quite a quick bounce back, and we'll be back to where we were by the end of next year. Is that possibly a little bit optimistic?
Well, that was basically an illustrative scenario to show the channels through which the hit to the economy would affect the public finances, which is roughly speaking that if you disrupt the economy, you lose tax revenues, and the government's policy response is pushing up spending, and both of those things push up borrowing. In practice, I think you're likely not to see the economy bouncing back to where we would have expected it otherwise to be by the end of the year, which is part of that assumption, but instead a rather slower recovery. And that will depend first on the pace at which public health restrictions are loosened, but also, of course, on the way in which people's behaviour responds. So if you allow people back into the workplace, back into shops, back into restaurants, will they actually go? Will they feel too nervous? So you would expect, I think, a slower recovery than the V shape that you simply make for that assumption.
So this is all based, as you say, on people's behaviour and guessing it ahead of time. It is perfectly possible that after this, people will not go out and spend in the way that economists hope they will.
Well, we have to wait and see. As you say, it's a matter of psychology as much as the concrete restrictions as well. We're also going to go through a period, I think, in which businesses are going to come out of this feeling the need to restructure the way in which they work, not simply to deal with a new temporary normal, hopefully, of greater social restriction, but also adjusting for the longer term. You would expect, for example, I think coming out of this, that more sales are going to be done online than you would previously have expected going into this. And will we have the same sized restaurant or retail sector that we went in? So there's businesses and individuals as well that have to adjust to this.
You used what I thought was a very interesting word a moment ago. I think the Governor of the Bank of England has used the same word when he's talked about scarring of the economy. In other words, that we come out of this not just with a smaller economy, but also a differently shaped economy. What's your research showing on how different the economy might be after COVID-19? Will there be sectors that have vanished completely and new sectors blooming in their place?
I think you can certainly see those sorts of adjustments, as I said. I mean, imagine, do you think that the restaurant sector is going to be the same size coming out of this as you went in? When we talk about scarring, we're basically talking about whether the short-term hit to the economy has permanent or at least very long-lasting consequences. And that can arise for three main reasons. We have a period in which some business investment will have been lost or cancelled. You also may have some businesses failing, part of that restructuring process you described, and also that some people who may have been furloughed and go then into unemployment find it harder to get back into the labour market. So all the government's policy measures and the Bank of England as well, by trying to support people's and businesses' incomes and to help them finance themselves through this, are designed entirely to try to minimise that scarring, which is also important for the future of the public finances as well.
Future of the high street?
Well, it's, as I say, you can imagine that there's a whole lot of decisions that people are going to have to take coming out of this in terms of what the right business structure is. Have they got the right number of outlets? How can you operate them on that sort of basis? So not just the high street, but I think a whole variety of sectors are going to need to be thinking about what business looks like in either the new normal or at least a sort of quite extended period of normal before we get there.
At the beginning of the interview, I mentioned that a huge amount of government debt hanging on the shoulders of the state, £300 billion or more. Can I ask you, is it possible going forward to sustain that level of debt without cutting spending or raising taxes or doing something like that?
Well, there's a distinction here between the stock of debt and the amount you're borrowing in any given year. So we're certainly going to see temporarily a considerably higher amount of government borrowing. We'll get the first figures for April on that later this week. The fact that the level of debt goes up on its own doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have the sort of austerity that followed the financial crisis. Much more important to that is whether you have this effect of the scarring of the economy, and if the economy is permanently smaller, then you get permanently less tax revenue, for example. Do we come out of this with a much bigger debt interest bill? At the moment, it's relatively cheap for the government to borrow, so hopefully that won't be too much of a problem. And then there'll also be political choices coming out of this. Do we want to spend a higher proportion of national income than we went in, for example, on health and social care? So all of those things together will shape the fiscal challenge for the government coming out of this. But a post-financial crisis style extended period of austerity is not a done deal.
And the Prime Minister has already told Tory MPs he doesn't want to do it either. But can I ask, this is a government with big ambitious ideas about more public spending, particularly in the Midlands and the north of England. Is that going to be sustainable given the level of debt we already have?
Well, as I say, I think it depends very much on what level of government borrowing, the ongoing amount, the ongoing gap between spending and receipts that you have. So the government's obviously going to have to put in place at some point a new set of spending plans. In the budget, it seems like a lifetime ago back in March, it put down some much more ambitious plans for capital spending. So it'll need to look at that. It'll need to look at whether you want to do more day-to-day spending in some areas of public services. And then, of course, if the consequences of that for government borrowing, the government decides are unacceptable, then there's always the option of looking at tax increases as well.
Robert Chote, thanks very much indeed for talking to us this morning.